pleasure.
It's 8:30 a.m. I call the March 11, 2022 meeting to order of the SDC's Board of Administration to order. Before we begin, I have a special announcement to make today. This past Wednesday, board member and SDCERS board president, Karina Coleman, resigned her board position appointment. Per board policy, the sitting vice president ascends to fill the office of president for the remainder of the term. And in this case, I will be serving as board president until our May meeting, at which time the board will consider its annual presidential appointment. Later in this meeting, I will be asking for volunteers to serve on a nominating committee and designate a chair. So please let me take the opportunity to thank Karina for her board service during her two terms. It's been a pleasure dealing with her. She left in very good standing and her service will be greatly missed. Additionally, board member Brett Bartolotta called us today and let us know that he will be unable to attend the meeting. So thank you. Rosie, could you please call the roll?
I would be happy to, Mr. President. Paul Kaufman?
Yes, I'm here.
Brett Bartolotta is absent. Thomas Battaglia?
Here, good morning.
Good morning. Michelle Bush?
Present.
Natasha Colora?
Here.
Lisa Marie Harris? Hasn't joined us yet. Charles HOGQUIST?
Present.
Paul Lodes?
Here.
Louis Maggi?
Here.
Louis Nguyen?
Here.
Clifford Shearson?
Good morning.
Good morning. And Roberta Spoon?
Present.
Thank you, Rosie. Do we have a quorum?
Yes, Mr. President, we do have a quorum.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. My apologies for responding late. I'm not used to this president thing. When voting on action items, the board secretary will call the roll for votes. And when you're making a nomination, a motion, or offering a second, please state your name as we move forward. So we're going to move on to section 3, public comments, as we start here. Rosie, do we have any public comment today?
Mr. President, we do have a public comment, and we will hold the comment until our disability action item number 7, where Mr. Keith Schneider will be speaking on his behalf.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Next, we're going to move on to take agenda section 5, business operations out of order, to consider a resolution to allow us to meet virtually today. So let's move on to business operations section 5. Our first business operation action item is to have the staff recommendation to adopt a resolution allowing the meeting to be held virtually pursuant to AB 361. Johnny, could you please provide the board background on this action item?
Yes, of course, Paul. Good morning, everyone. So in order for us to meet virtually the way we are today from our private residences and elsewhere, the law requires us to pass the proposed resolution. We've done this every meeting since the law came into effect in November last year. I will need a first and a second and a roll call vote, please.
I'll make the first, Bobby Spoon.
Tom will second.
Rosie, do we need to take a roll call on this?
Yes, Mr. President. Paul Kaufman?
Go ahead. Yes.
Thomas Battaglia?
Yes.
Michelle Bush?
Yes.
Natasha Colora?
Yes.
Is Lisa Marie Harris with us yet? Doesn't sound like it.
She is joining with audio right now.
Wonderful. Charles HOGQUIST?
Present. Yes.
Paul Lodes?
Yes.
Louis Maggi?
Yes.
Louis Nguyen,
Yes.
Clifford CHIRESON,
Yes.
Roberta Spoon,
Yes.
and with that, the motion passes 10-0.
Thank you, Rosie.
My pleasure.
Our next business operations action item is for the staff to recommend to adopt the June 30, 2021 actuarial valuation results for the City of San Diego, the San Diego Unified Port District, and the San Diego County Regional Airport Authority. With us today to present the actuarial reports are SDC's actuarial consultant, Jean Karlowski, and Alice Alberg. Sorry if I got that pronouncement wrong. Both with Chiron. Jean, I understand you have a presentation for us today?
Yes, it's very brief. I mean, it's the same presentation as in January, but more brief. So we'll just hit the highlights.
Fine.
If you can go to the next page, we'll, as usual, talk about the historical trends and key in on the current results, remind you of how you compare to your peers, and then we'll end with the projections. Next slide, please. So this is June 30th, 2021 valuation was completed and presented initially to the board in January. We're now here in March, which is the normal practice that's been done for many years now. And once the board approves, or if the board approves, the city then would make the actual determined contribution on July 1st this year. Skip 2 slides now. This slide shows you the growth in liabilities in the blue bars since 1995. And the lines are the asset measures. There's the market value, which is the blue or green line, and the smooth value is the gold line. You had a period between 95 and 2000, we call the roaring 90s. The investment markets were strong. You were nearly fully funded. Then dot-com crash happened in 2001. At the same time, you had some controversies going on with MP1, MP2 in the period 2002 to 5. System made a recovery all the way up until 2007, and then the Great Recession hit. And one of the things you can look at in this chart, that gold line, whenever there's a down market, the gold line hangs higher, so it shows that the asset smoothing is working. And if you look to this year, 2021, the reverse happens. The market value was great, and we held the value lower. So it's, but you are now, if you measured your fund at a market value basis, well, first on smooth value, you're at 74.3% in the upper right there. But if we were to measure it on market value, your market value of assets are over 82% funded, and that's the highest the system has been funded since 20 years ago. And what's most important is 20 years ago, you had an 8% discount rate, and now you've got a 6.5% discount rate. So this plan is in much stronger position than it's pretty much ever been in this period. The next chart shows the pattern of city contributions. I mentioned the controversies of 2002 to 5. It's just the city was underfunding what the actuary was determining as the contribution. And then since then, either have been paying more or the exact amount each and every year. And that has really contributed to the improvement in the plan's funded status. Alice will take you through the historical trends for the Port District and the airport now.
Okay, thanks, Jean. So we see here a similar pattern in the funded ratio and the liabilities for the Port District. So the bars shown here show that increase in liability over time, and those assets at this point in time trailing the top of the liabilities. So for the current year, the port sits at 78.2% funded. And again, we see that the market value of assets is higher than the actuarial smooth value of assets. So we know that in the coming year, we can expect to phase in some of those deferred gains in the following valuation year. On the next slide, we have the historical contributions for the Port District. We see year over year that the port continually pays the actuarially determined contribution. In the fiscal year 2022 evaluation, we saw quite a jump from 2021 to 2022. That was with the modified or updated demographic assumptions. And then this year in 2023, we see a decline in that actually determined contribution, and we'll see the sources of change coming up in a later slide. For the Airport Authority, has steadily maintained a much higher funded ratio, given their underlying internal policy to strive to maintain a 90% funded ratio and then a 95% funded ratio given certain targets. And so we see for 2021 that their funded ratio is well above 90%, sitting at 94.6%. And they have market value of assets that are notably above the actuarial liability. So they're well on track, moving in the right direction for 100% funded here. And the following slide shows how have they achieved that strong funded status. And we see in many years across the board here where the gold bars, the contributions that are actually paid by the airport, are higher than the actually determined contributions. And that contribution, that additional contribution, served to ramp up the assets and really has allowed them to maintain and achieve that high funded ratio. And in 2022 to 2023, we see that drop in the actuarially determined contribution, and we'll see again the sources of change in that and get into the details in a further slide.
So now,
next slide, yeah, go ahead.
We move on to the current results that were completed as of June 30th, 2021, and I'll start with the city results. Next slide. So we've got three areas in this chart. The top third is the membership data, then come the assets and liabilities in the gray area, and then the contributions in the gold. I think the thing to note on the membership is that you see the payroll is showing a decline. That's because we're still not reflecting the Prop B, new hires coming in as of June 30th, 2021. That'll change in future years. But the average benefit has gone up by 3.6%, and the average salary has gone up by 1.7%. On the assets and liabilities, I think the most important numbers are the unfunded liability, which is dropping nearly, nearly 400 million. And then the funded ratio on a smooth basis is 74. And as I mentioned earlier, on a market value, it's over 80%. And then the city's contribution, and the key number is the 414 last year has now dropped to 84. So that's a $30 million decline drop for the city. The next slide shows the sources of change, and it was a pretty bland year in the terms of the experience was almost identical to that expected. Due to contributions and interest on liabilities and the like, we would have expected liabilities to grow by 263 million and assets by 291. And then netting that out, you get the unfunded and like, but the actual asset experience was spectacular. And even on a smooth basis, we're only reflecting 1/3 here, 355 million more than expected. The liability, we're really happy about this. Liabilities almost came right on with a very tiny gain of 0.4 million. And that's telling you that our assumptions are working. And this is the first valuation following the experience study that we had done. And there were no changes in assumptions. And then the miscellaneous items, basically purchase service contracts and drop. Yes, that increased liabilities, but it also increased assets, and the net is zero. So things, it was a very good year, as we've been saying from the past presentation, and the experience was pretty much as we expected. Alice?
All right, so moving on to the port, we have a similar summary of results here for the port. In the membership section, I'd like to point out that the average salary increased by 5.1%. And that increase in average salary led to a slight decrease, a slight loss in the liability that we'll see on the following slide. in the section, the gray section on assets and liabilities, similar to what Jean pointed out for the city, the unfunded actuarial liability went down by 11.3%. So those strong asset returns were very favorable in and shown there in that reflection of the unfunded going down significantly.
Can you help me understand what in-pay status means?
Yes, in-pay status. So those are anyone who is currently receiving a benefit. So we have retirees, disabled members, and beneficiaries as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then in the gold section there, when we see the makeup of the ADC, the ADC for the current year decreased by 13.1% from 22.1 to 19.2 million. And again, it's the strong asset returns that drove that decrease. So on the next slide, when we break down and view the sources of change, that actuarial liability column, so the actuarial liability was very similar as expected. There was a slight liability experience loss where we see that increase in actuarial liability of 4.4 million. And that was due to the salary being slightly higher than expected, as I pointed out in the prior slide. The assets were expected to increase by 19.9 million, and they had a very strong return, over 25% on the market value return and over 10% on the actuarial value of assets. So that increased assets above expected by 22.1 million. So in net, the UAL overall decreased from 161.8 million to 143.4 million. And that translates to the decrease in the ADC because each one of those components led to that decreasing ADC value, where you see the asset experience brought it down by 2.0 million. On the next slide, we see a similar summary, this time for the Airport Authority. The Airport Authority, I'm gonna put your eyes in the membership section to that same line on the average salary. Here, the average salary only increased by 0.7%, and that did end up leading to a slight gain on liabilities for them. The unfunded had a stellar, the assets had a stellar performance, which led to a very large decrease in that unfunded actuarial liability from 24 million to 13.6 million. And in terms of the ADC decreased from 6.5 million to just under 5 million from those gains. When we look at the sources of change on the next slide, we see a similar pattern of sources of change. For the actuarial liability, though, the airport did have experienced a gain, and that was due to those salaries being slightly less than expected. But overall, the strong asset performance brought down the UAL, brought down the ADC, and in turn, we see that the components that the ADC went from that 6.5 to 4.9 million for the coming fiscal year payment.
So that concludes the valuation results. We have two more items to briefly discuss. The first is your peer comparisons. So we go up 2 slides. No, back one. So this slide is a graphic from the survey data from the public plans database as of June 2021. It's a joint effort by NASRA and the Center of Retirement Research at Boston College. And then we teamed with both of them to produce this tool that can compare any system to the other systems in the database. There's about 200 plans, the largest public plans in the country. And what we're looking at here is a distribution by percentiles of where plans are on their funded ratio. If you're, by the way, SDCERS would be the gold diamond. But if you're in between the dark blue and the dark green, that exactly in between the two of them, you're at the median. So if you're below that, you're in the lower half. You're above that, you're in the upper half. And you can see SDCERS was in the lower half all the way up until 2007, and then 2008. It appears they were at the median, and then they started climbing up higher and higher to where now we don't have the data for the other funds in 2021, but you certainly compare very favorably to other plans. And on this basis, we've normalized everybody to a 6.5% discount rate. So it's repeating that you've got a strong system with strong assumptions. And as plans in California like to do, Alice will compare you to the other California plans. This is not done on the East Coast. It's
on
a California
this next
thing.
slide here, let's see. All right. So in the top, we are looking at the funded status on a market value of assets basis. And then on the bottom, showing a distribution of the discount rate assumption. Now, what's different about this slide compared to the public plan across the nation versus the California plan, the upper graph, we did not normalize the funded ratio. So we see that the city of San Diego on a market value, that gold diamond for this year at 82% funded. So it's slightly below the midpoint there compared to the peers. But take a look at the bottom graph, that distribution of the discount rate. SDCERS is in that hashed bar at 6.5%. So the majority of the plans are using a discount rate, which is higher than what SDCERS is using. And even so, the upper graph is showing that that the funded ratio at 82% on a market value basis is only slightly below the median amongst the peers. So that's,
I assume if we had normalized it, you'd be above the median.
yes.
The
That
last
really
thing-
shows the strong standing. Yes, go ahead, Jim.
The last thing we have is just projections. And this is a projection assuming you earn 6.5% each and every year, which isn't going to happen each and every year, but it gives you a baseline and shows you're approaching full funding. On the top graph, those are your assets and liabilities. And the bottom graph showing the employer and member contributions. And you see the significant drop once the unfunded liability is fully amortized. Now, I mentioned this is not going to happen, and I don't know, Greg or Marcel, do you know what the year-to-date return has been for the fund?
I'm going to let Liza answer that one.
Well, through December, it's about 5.6, but obviously in the first quarter, we've given most of that back.
So what I did is I ran, suppose you have 0 for the year. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner, it's showing the returns. Normally, if we were there in person, we'd be showing you a live model. We could plug it in front of you. But you see that ADC column, which is the third column, where it's showing the 23 fiscal year, 384.3, and then the following year, 400. When I plug in a 0, that following year, that 400 goes up to 415. So that gives you a sense of the sensitivity of next year's results to the returns. Hopefully, we'll be returning to in-person meetings where we can run this and answer any questions you may have with different type of investment scenarios. Alice, do you want to show them the same for the others? That'd be great.
Sure. So to finish it off, we'll take a look at the port's projection model. And with the 6.5% assumed return, we see that the port has a handful of years down at the bottom, the gold bars stay high and steady, and that high and steady payment is because of the UAL payment floor, which was enacted. So whenever that UAL payment is calculated to be below the 13.3 million, the UAL payment floor holds it up at that higher rate to pay off the unfunded quicker. And then we see that beginning in 2031, that that the port would be paying the normal cost plus expected administrative expenses once the UAL is fully paid off. And on the next slide, when we look at the airport projections, the airport is reaching full funding much sooner. The strong investment returns for this year will be continue to flow into the results next year's valuation. The airport has about 2 years left of unfunded, and then the payment for the ADC, that annual contribution, is the bulk of it is the normal cost, so the cost of future service for the membership group. So they're in strong standing, reaching 100% funded in just a couple years out.
One of the things I realized I failed to mention when we were showing the city is that in the projections, we are assuming new hires coming back into the system, but the current valuation results do not have, for the past service, that liabilities coming in. We're in the middle of that project now, as well as, Alice, you may want to mention the Airport Authority project? No? Okay.
Yeah. Let's see here. Yes, so the airport is just the standard projection.
Okay, so that concludes our formal presentation. If you have any further questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Would any board member like to ask the actuaries a question or speak on the matter? Okay, since I don't have any responses, I'd like a motion and a second from a board member to approve the actuarial report.
This is Charlie. I move we accept it.
And this is
Lou, I'll second.
Second.
Okay. Rosie, can you call the roll, please?
Yes, just a moment. Just to confirm, was that Louis Nguyen or Lou Maji?
Maggie.
Thank you so much. Paul Kaufman,
Yes.
Thomas Battaglia,
Yes.
Michelle Bush,
Yes.
Natasha Kalora,
Yes.
Lisa Marie Harris, and good morning.
Morning, yes.
Charles HOGQUIST,
Aye.
Paul Lodes,
Yes.
Louis Maji,
Yes.
Louis Nguyen,
Yes.
Clifford Shearson,
Yes.
Roberta Spoon,
Yes.
and with that, the motion passes 11-0.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gene and Alice. This finishes our business operations agenda item. At this time, I would like to take agenda item section 8, Business and Governance Committee agenda, out of order at the request of the committee chair. So we'll move on.
Say goodbye then.
Okay. Thanks very much, Gene and Alice. The Business and Governance Committee Chair, Bobby Spoon, would you please provide your committee report?
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for taking my report out of order. I have a flight to catch later this morning, so I need to leave early. The committee met yesterday and approved the action items by unanimous vote. Before I review all the action items and make a motion for the consent agenda, are there any action items that the board would like pulled for discussion in a separate vote? All right, hearing none. Moving on to the action items. Number 1 was staff's recommendation to adopt a resolution to allow the meeting to be held virtually, and the committee unanimously adopted that resolution. Number 2, staff's recommendation to delegate the selection and contract execution for Chief Investment Officer recruitment services to Chief Executive Officer. And Greg made a presentation. The committee unanimously approved the Chief Executive Officer to select and contract with a recruitment firm to assist with the very difficult job of finding a replacement for Liza. Staff received 3 proposals from national search firms with the ability to source diverse candidate pools. Staff expects to complete the search prior to Liza's retirement. Number 3, staff's recommendation to extend Chiron's actuarial services contract through June 30, 2024, and Marcel presented for this one. And our committee unanimously adopted staff's recommendation to extend the consulting actuary's contract to provide project continuity with the reopening of the city's retirement plan and to implement the upcoming experience study. This would be a very difficult time to change actuaries in the middle of and the experience study. So the committee unanimously adopted that recommendation. Number 4, staff's recommendation to approve an IRIS architecture upgrade project with Sagitech Solutions. And Michelle presented for this one, and our committee unanimously adopted staff's recommendation to upgrade the IRIS architecture to keep our member support applications based on current software releases. Number 5, staff's recommendation to approve a new master services agreement with CGI Technologies and Solutions for application support services. And David Bond presented this. Our committee again unanimously adopted staff's recommendation to approve a new master services agreement with CGI with a contract period to mirror the city's agreement period of 4 years with 2 optional 2-year contract extensions. Number 6, staff's recommendation to approve the SDCERS fiscal year 2023 administrative budget, and Ted LaSalvia presented the budget. The committee unanimously adopted staff's recommendation to approve next year's administrative budget. Although the staffing plan is the same for next year's this year, the labor costs are increasing as the city and SDCERS adjust the wages to address the recruitment and retention issues. The budget includes funds for moving operations to a smaller workspace along with an expected rent decrease. Information technology projects continue to be an important and necessary cost factor. Overall, the administrative costs are expected to be $15.8 million this year and $17.3 million next year, which is approximately 16 basis points on assets under management. Administrative costs are passed through to each of the respective plan sponsors through their actuarially determined contributions. And I have to compliment Ted on his work in putting this together and the very excellent presentation that he gave yesterday. Number 7, staff's recommendation to amend the audit committee charter and the internal auditor charter. Sarah, again, the committee unanimously approved these changes. Sarah Dixon presented the reformatted charters, which better reflect the current duties and expectations for the committee to operate at a policy level and for the internal auditor and management to operate at the implementation level. Sarah also presented wording that was added to the charter to allow for closed session discussions about pertinent matters in compliance with the Brown Act. The B&G committee, as I said, unanimously adopted this motion to amend both the committee charter and the internal audit charter. And again, I'd like to compliment Sarah on her very diligent work in reframing the audit committee charter. It has, the nature of the audit committee has changed over time since I've been on the board, and it was time for the charter to reflect those changes. Number 8, staff's recommendation to amend the board and closed board session policy, closed session disability hearing policy, communications policy, and returning to work after retirement policy. And the committee unanimously adopted these recommendations. The amendments were minor. 9, staff's recommendation to amend board rule 6.4, which are the drop annuity rates, 7.8, which are the conduct of adjudications, 9.5, which are payment of active drop accounts, and Division 11 of the board rules, which relates to community property. The committee unanimously adopted these recommendations, and again, the amendments were minor. And that's it for our action items. Is there any further discussion on any of these items? Any board members have any questions? All right, hearing none. I move the Business and Governance Committee consent agenda items. Don't need a second, is my understanding. So Rosie, will you please call for the vote?
Yes. Paul Kaufman,
Yes?
Thomas Battaglia,
Yes.
Michelle Bush,
Yes.
Natasha Kalora,
Yes.
Lisa Marie Harris,
Yes.
Charles HOGQUIST,
Aye.
Paul Lotz,
Yes.
Louis Maggi,
Yes.
Louis Nguyen,
Yes.
Clifford Cheerson,
Yes.
Roberta Spoon,
Yes.
and with that, the motion passes 11-0.
Thank you very much, Bobby. We're going to return to where we left off the agenda with Section 4, approval of,
Well-
yes.
I have just a couple other things.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. The committee heard reports we heard oral reports from Member Services Division from Victoria Fedelicio, and it was the first time that she's presented to our committee, and she did an excellent job. And I just wanted to compliment her on her thoroughness and her very professional presentation. Marcel gave a presentation on benefits administration where she provided an update on unwinding Prop 2. Very, very interesting. And David Bond gave a report in that he reported that in response to the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency issued a Shields Up alert, and they recommend all organizations, regardless of size, adopt a heightened posture when it comes to cybersecurity. SDCERS IT has in place and maintains the tenants and security posture recommended by those agencies. And SDCERS and their contractor Zenzar have seen no specific threat activity related to the current Russia-Ukraine conflict. We also had written reports from legal, finance, members owing in excess of $10,000 and the training report. And if there are no further questions, that's the end of my report. Back to you, Paul.
Okay, I guess that's it, Bobby, huh?
Yep, that's it
Okay.
That's it for me.
Have a nice flight.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on to where we originally left off the agenda and move into Section 4, which is approval of the consent items. I think this is for, Charlie, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is for disabilities.
Paul, this is Greg.
Yes.
This is actually your handling, so.
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry, my apologies. So we're moving into Section 4, approval of consent items. First A is service retirements. The second one is deferred retirement option plan drop entries. Item C is a deferred retirement option plan drop retirements. We're going to pull consent item D for separate discussion and vote. So may I please have a motion and a second for consent items A through C.
This is Charlie. I make the motion.
Thank you, Charlie. Rosie, I think we don't need a second on this, so can you please call the roll call?
Mr. President, if
Actually,
we could
Paul,
please
we
get
do
a
need a
second.
second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Get a second.
I'll second it, Bobby.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ms. Paul Kaufman,
Yes?
Thomas Battaglia,
Yes.
Michelle Bush,
Yes.
Natasha Kalora,
Yes.
Lisa Marie Harris, Lisa Marie Harris,
Yes, please.
Charles HOGQUIST,
Aye.
Paul Lotz,
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Louis Maggi?
Paul Oates, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Oates. Louis Maggi?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Louis Nguyen?
Yes.
Clifford CHIRESON?
Yes.
Roberta Spoon?
Yes.
And with that, we have the motion pass 11-0.
Thank you very much, Rosie.
My pleasure.
We're going to move on to item D, which is training. Consent item D, training, is being pulled for a separate vote to consider approving attendance of a board member at an upcoming conference. So, Greg, could you please provide some background on this item?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Board members and audit committee members are encouraged to attend educational conferences to stay abreast of best practices in the public pension plan governance, operations oversight, and institutional investments. And in January, the board members were and are encouraged to create a calendar year education plan at the beginning of the year to take advantage of early registration discounts and reserve time in their calendars. Board member Lou Maggi's calendar recently changed and allowed him to attend the highly recommended Advanced Principles of Pension Governance Conference sponsored by CalPERS, the California Association of Public Retirement Systems. This conference will be held in person March 30th through April 1st at the UCLA Lufkin Center in their Los Angeles campus. Staff recommend Lou Maggi's educational plan include this conference using the following motion for approval. Motion to approve consent item D, educational conferences, to include on Lou Maggi's 2022 educational plan, the CalPERS Advanced Principles of Pension Governance, being held March 30th through April 1st in Los Angeles, California. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Greg. Can I have a motion and a second by the board members on this item?
I'll make that motion.
Move.
Lisa, you were making the motion?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a second?
Second, Michelle Bush.
Thank you, Michelle. Rosie, could you call the roll for this, please?
Yes. Paul Kaufman?
Yes.
Thomas Battaglia?
Yes.
Michelle Bush?
Yes.
Natasha Kalora?
Yes.
Lisa Marie Harris?
Yes.
Charles HOGQUIST?
Aye.
Paul Oates?
Yes.
Louis Maggi?
I'll recuse.
Louis Nguyen?
Yes.
Clifford CHIRESON?
Yes.
Roberta Spoon?
Yes.
And with that, the motion passes 10-0.
Thank you, Rosie. Next, we're going to move on to Section 6 of the Audit Committee. So, LANA RADCHENKO, could you please provide your committee report?
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. The Audit Committee report the Audit Committee met on Wednesday, March 9th. We had 2 action items, one of which, similar to the other groups, is a resolution to hold the meeting virtually, and that was passed 4-0. And as Roberta mentioned already, we also discussed the amendment to the Audit Committee Charter and the Internal Audit Charter, and that item also passed 4-0. As well, there were some informational items. Sarah Dixon presented on the San Diego Unified Port District payroll audit, and there was some discussion around that. There was also 2 other reports, one from David Bond, who discussed the cybersecurity update, and the second report was Marcel delivering the Benefits Administration Division report. We also had a closed session during the audit committee on Wednesday, and Alfred Coe from RSM and Sarah Dixon, sorry, Sarah, shared closed session comments regarding the privacy audit, which was completed in February of 2022. And that is the report. The next audit committee meeting is scheduled for July 6th of 2022.
Thank you, Lana. Okay, we're going to move on to section 7, which is the Disability Committee. Charlie, we're going to get to you here. So if you could,
okay.
If it's your turn.
I believe we're going to create the consent agenda. We had 7 items, but I believe item number 7 is going to be pulled for public comment. I just want to confirm that. Is that the case, Rosie?
Yes, Mr. HOGQUIST, that would be
Okay.
indeed the case.
Okay, we'll handle the first 6 items, and then we'll go to item 7 separately. The first item, of course, was Johnny's wonderful presentation so that we could vote to have our meeting virtually, and that approved unanimously. We also had 6 applications for disability retirement. The staff recommended the approval of 3 of those, and those were all voted unanimously for approval, if anybody has any questions on those 3. We also had 2 from hearing officers, and the result was the hearing officer recommended that those disability applications be denied. And again, the committee voted unanimously to deny those. And if there's no other questions or comments on that, we will take number 7, where we have a public speaker.
Charlie, would you like to vote on the consent agenda?
Oh, yes, that is correct. Sorry about that. I'm ahead of myself. I'm using 2 computers to try to read names and talk. Okay, I want to make a move that we accept and approve the consent agenda.
I second Michelle Bush.
Paul Kaufman,
Yes.
Thomas Battaglia,
Yes.
Michelle Bush,
Yes.
Natasha Kalora,
Yes.
Lisa Marie Harris, Lisa Marie
Yes.
Harris. Thank you. Charles HOGQUIST,
Aye.
Paul Lotz,
Yes.
Yes.
Louis Maggi,
Yes.
Louis Nguyen,
Yes.
Clifford Chierson,
Yes.
Roberta Spoon.
Yes.
And with that, the motion passes 11-0.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to item number 7, which is Cole, which is the hearing officer's recommendation to grant an industrial disability retirement for the applicant Keith Schneider. And our speaker is, you have 3 minutes.
Mr. Schneider, would you please confirm your audio is working before we proceed? Once we confirm, you will have the 3 allotted minutes to speak, and then we will proceed with our agenda.
Oh, yes, I'm here. I do not wish to speak.
Okay. Like I said, this is your chance. If you don't wish to speak, we will move forward with the agenda.
Proceed.
Okay. Staff has recommended that we approve Mr. Snyder's disability application. In the committee, it was a unanimous vote for approval, and I will move for approval. Do I have a second?
Bobby, I'll second it.
Okay. Rosie, can you take the roll?
Yes. Paul Kaufman,
Yes.
Thomas Battaglia,
Yes.
Michelle Bush,
Yes.
Natasha Kalora,
Yes.
Lisa Marie Harris,
Yes.
Charles HOGQUIST,
Aye.
Paul Lotz,
Yes.
Louis Maggi,
Yes.
Louis Nguyen,
Yes.
Clifford CHIRESON,
Yes.
Roberta Spoon,
Yes.
and with that, motion passes 11-0.
Okay. Mr. President, we have one more thing. We had a report from Sandra Clausen on the status of our disability applications.
Okay, go ahead.
And I do want to just let everybody know that they're keeping on top of it. And I did commend Sandra and their staff on taking good care of our injured members and just keeping the applications going. And there's nobody long in the queue. And I'm really proud of that they're doing such a great job. So I just wanted to let you hear that.
Thank you, Charlie. Appreciate the report. We're going to move on to Section 9, which is the Investment Committee. Cliff CHIRESON is our committee chairman. So would you please provide your committee report, Cliff?
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Our investment committee met yesterday afternoon for a very content-filled and interesting discussion. We had 3 action items, all of which were approved unanimously. The first was, as others have as well, the recommendation to adopt the resolution to allow the meeting to take place in a virtual format. And again, that passed unanimously. The second action item was a discussion and then ultimately recommendation to approve the 2022 Asset-Liability study. And for this, I'd like to turn the chair over to Aon for comments on this important topic.
Good morning. This is Steve Boss. I'm the lead investment consultant from Aon. Happy to be here with you today. It's good to see you all. It's been a while since we've been together in person. If we could go ahead and bring the slide deck up and put it to slide 5, we'll start there. As Cliff mentioned, we had a good discussion yesterday. We're going to continue that at a somewhat of a higher level today. Joining me in this meeting is Phil Kavarkas. Phil presented to the investment committee yesterday the depth of the asset liability study. This really fits nicely with the presentation you already had earlier this morning from Jean and from Alice. They presented the table, set the table as it relates to your liabilities. We're going to bring that together. We use their data. We project the liability growth and changes relative to asset growth and changes. And Phil's going to draw your attention to some key slides there in just a few minutes. We do these every 3 years. The last time that we came before this board was 2019. We recognize that there's many new members. So please do ask questions as they come to mind. Phil's going to draw your attention to a number of exhibits. There's one I want to point out before I turn it over to Phil, and that's the bottom of the right-hand side of this table. And the divergence of these 2 lines is something that's particularly important, and the investment committee spent some time on this yesterday. This shows the net cash outflow, so the differences between contributions and benefit payments going out to participants. And you can see previously, before Prop B and the subsequent changes to the program, that negative cash outflow was getting quite significant, growing upwards of 7%. Because of the repeal of that, your cash flow situation changes quite a bit. Why is that important? It's important because that gives us the wherewithal to invest in less liquid assets, things like private equity, infrastructure, and real estate, assets that have performed quite spectacularly over the last several years and last year in particular. One item of note, and Phil will draw your attention to other exhibits. So I will stop there. And again, please do ask questions as they come to mind. But Phil, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Steve. And hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you virtually, at least. The intent of this discussion then is to provide an overview for the asset liability study that we ran. As Steve mentioned, we run them every 3 years. I'm going to highlight some of the changes since the last study, and then also articulate some of the high-level outcomes from our analysis, talk about some of the high-level outcomes from our portfolio analysis, from our asset liability projection analysis, and from our liquidity analysis. And the bottom line is there are a lot of things that have changed since the last study. We saw changes due to Proposition B, as you can see on the page, changes to the shortfall amortization in the funding into the plan. And so there were a lot of things that we needed to contemplate that were new this time around versus last time around. Now, the good news is this. As I'll show, lots of the key pension plan financials are pointing in the right direction. And so we like that. We think that there's a lot to like with the existing strategy today, and we'll articulate why we think so. And so that's the question for today. There might be a different strategy that sometime down the road. Now, I don't think that's imminent, but nonetheless, it'll be important for you to go in with your eyes open to think about what's the right strategy for today and what's the right strategy for down the line. Now, just to start talking specifics, you can see, as Steve articulated on the bottom of this page, we show two graphs. And when we think about the key change, one of the key changes this time versus last time, bottom left-hand corner shows the liability growth into the future. Bottom right-hand corner shows the net outflows going into the future. And when we look at the bottom left, the liability projections, the blue line is the liabilities for this study, reflective of Proposition B, where we reopen the plan. The black line represents what we were projecting in the last study. That was before the plans were reopened. And so you can see the liabilities fairly flat in our last study. And now we're showing liabilities that are growing. These are results that were pulled directly from Chiron's latest actuarial evaluation as our starting point. So it is a very different picture to see liabilities growing instead of flat. And of course, if you want your assets to keep pace, your assets will need to grow as well to keep pace with your liabilities over time. Good news is we believe they will. Net outflows, as Steve mentioned, on the right. And so here, where we thought you were going to have a net outflow position that was fairly sizable and increasing over time as the plan matured and became more heavily retiree in nature, we now see more of a steady net outflows. In other words, a plan that's not necessarily maturing and doesn't have as significant an issue in terms of the net outflows. So those are important as we consider the changes last time versus this time. Next page covers kind of the three key facets of the study. What do we see in our portfolio analysis? What do we see in our asset liability projection analysis? What do we see in our liquidity analysis? And as it relates to the portfolio, as I mentioned, a lot to like there. 78% return-seeking assets as we see it with the current portfolio. We believe it's well diversified. Expected return on that portfolio based on our latest and greatest actuarial assumptions at 6.37% is the expected return on the asset portfolio versus 6.5 for the actuarial interest rate assumption, very similar. As it relates to the asset liability projection analysis, I mentioned the impact of Proposition B and also all the numbers pointing in a favorable direction over the long run. And we'll show you what that looks like as well. And then finally, as it relates to the liquidity analysis, we examined whether, on a go-forward basis, the plan maintains significant liquidity in not just in the expected case, but also in stressed market cases where liquidity might be compromised. And we find generally favorable liquidity profile, even in the most dire of economic instances. I'll describe that. I'll show you that analysis as well. That's it at a high level. Now I'm going to dive into a little bit of the detail just to illustrate some of our points. On the very next page, page 8 of the presentation, we show the asset liability profiles. And again, this is using the Chiron actuarial valuation as our jumping off point. And you can see we've summarized for the City of San Diego plan, the Unified Port District plan, and the Airport Authority plan, as well as the total. We've summarized the assets, the liabilities, the funded ratio. And so you can see, for example, in total, $10.29 billion of market value of assets, $12.39 billion of liabilities, 83.1% funded in total. The city plan is the lion's share of those assets and liabilities. You can see that the $9.457 billion of assets 11.478 billion of liabilities, 82% funded is the starting point. And you'll see that in our projections, which are fairly similar to the Chiron projections. Down below that, you can see some hurdle rate analysis. Now, the hurdle rate analysis is an examination of the liabilities growth and then comparing that liability growth rate to the asset growth rate to make sure that the assets are keeping pace with the liabilities over time. We find that for the city plan, the liabilities are growing at about 7.85% per year. Now, because the plan's underfunded, and because the plan's 82.4% funded, the assets have to grow even faster just to keep pace with the liabilities. 9.52% is the asset hurdle rate. So in other words, you need your assets to grow 9.52% just to tread water. Now, the good news is we expect the assets to grow faster than 9.52%. We expect them to grow at about 11.49%, representing about a 2% hurdle rate surplus, 1.97% to be exact. And what does that mean? That means that we would expect your funded ratio to grow to the tune of about 2% per year in the case, if everything were to work out exactly as expected. So that's good news, because that tells us that we would expect the funded ratio to grow from 82.4% by about 2% per year for the city plan. We would expect similar things for the Unified Port District plan. And then the Airport Authority is a little bit different in that this plan is slightly overfunded on a market value basis, as Chiron mentioned earlier. There we would expect the hurdle rate to be met. So in other words, we think you're overfunded, and we would expect you to stay overfunded in that plan. And I'll show you more specifics as we go. So that's it at a very high level as it relates to the starting point. The next slide is an initial look at the portfolio analysis. And here you can see a graph on the upper left-hand corner of the page. You can see on the vertical axis expected return on assets, and on the horizontal axis the volatility of those assets. And you can see there are a variety of dots, and the color coding for those dots is summarized down below. For example, equities are summarized in those red bubbles, if you will. Safety assets in dark gray, that's things like investment grade bonds, et cetera. And the size of the dot, the size of the bubble, represents the degree of allocation to each of these various asset classes. And you can see that there's a wide swath of instruments that across the risk spectrum, some low risk and low reward, some high risk and high reward, and everything in between. You can see that no one dot swamps all the other dots. In other words, all of these assets are well diversified. We like the nature of the diversified nature of the portfolio build. There's a lot to like there. The star, of course, is the sum total of those assets. You can see 6.37% expected return, 12.34% volatility. And you can see off to the right a table which summarizes each of those asset classes and their respective capital market assumptions, according to our Aon's capital market assumption set. Next slide summarizes the range of portfolio outcomes. Here we've examined not just the current policy, which is summarized in the middle. We've also examined portfolios which are lower and higher risk than the current policy. Just to start with the current policy, you can see, and that's summarized in the middle there, you can see that the central expectation for returns for the current policy is 6.37%. Now, of course, that's a central expectation. The portfolio has portfolio risk associated with it. And so there's a range of potential outcomes, cumulative outcomes over the next several years. The bottom end of the range, 2.76% in a more pessimistic scenario. And on the top of the range, 10.11%. So there's a range of potential outcomes around the 6.37, which is our central expectation. You can see how that compares to the actuarial interest rate of 6.5%, pretty close in terms of the how your portfolio lines up with the actuarial assumption. And then you can see what happens if you move to the left. Effectively, what you're doing is you're moving to a less risky portfolio. You would expect a smaller expected return, but with narrower tails. In other words, more certain results, albeit a lower one. And you can see progressively, even moving to the 60% return-seeking portfolio, a lesser return expectation still, with even less in the way of volatility. And the converse is true if you move to the right. You can move to the 90%, 100% return-seeking portfolios. And of course, those have higher expected returns with greater dispersion of outcomes. Next slide covers historical in the way of actuarial interest rate assumptions. Chiron has already covered this. 6.5% is the actuarial interest rate assumption. I'm not going to spend any time there. Interest of time, let's move to the next slide, which starts the discussion of our asset liability projection analysis. Now, our asset liability projection analysis is a stochastic Monte Carlo simulation analysis, 5,000 economic trials over the next 20 years. And those 5,000 economic trials contain the best of times, the worst of times, and everything in between. And you can see, and this is just an illustration, these aren't your numbers yet. The following page starts with your numbers. But just to demonstrate the point, we run a single simulation, and you can see it's effectively, it's a squiggly line. These aren't smooth progressions, but rather are reflective of what might happen in practice, which is some good years and some bad. And so you can see what a squiggly line might look like in terms of your funded ratio progression over the next several years. Well, we do that 5,000 times, and what you get is a cloud of outcomes. And that's very difficult to interpret. And so what we do is summarize that cloud of outcomes in terms of percentiles. And so the black dotted line represents the central case. That's the median, the 50th percentile. And that's going to be the key point that we focus on. But of course, the central case, the 50th percentile, things could be better or worse than that. And so we will also examine the optimistic outcomes, which are effectively the light green and the dark green, which are the optimistic outcomes, and then the pessimistic outcomes, which are the blue cases, the light blue and dark blue. It's the bottom, the dark blue line is the 5th percentile, the light blue line is the 25th, the black dotted line is the 50th percentile, 75th, and 95th percentile of the distribution. Now, just to illustrate your specific numbers on the next page, you can see what the city plan looks like today and going forward. So here we've examined those same 5 portfolio strategies, your current policy, and then the 70% and 60% return-seeking portfolio, as well as the 90% and 100% return-seeking portfolios. But starting with the current policy, which is 78% return-seeking, you can see what the numbers look like today and going forward. Starting point, 82% funded, as we described previously, again, using Chiron as our jumping off point. And what does that look like on a go-forward basis in the expected case? Looking at the black dotted line, our projections show that you hit full funding in year 2032, with progression thereafter up to 114% funded. Now you can see, of course, that's the central expectation. If things are less than projected, you might have some of the more pessimistic cases down below. The light blue represents the 25th percentile. And the worst case scenario, the 95th or the 5th percentile, 57% funded on the downside. And of course, the converse is also true. You could have an optimistic outcome with results in green. You can see that in the most optimistic cases, you're surpassing 100% funded well in advance of 2032. And you can see what happens as you flex your investment strategy. If you were to use a less risky investment strategy, let's say, for example, the 70% return-seeking portfolio instead of the 78% return-seeking portfolio, well, the results are about what you'd expect, which is a slightly longer time to full funding, not 2032, but rather 2037. And a lower ultimate funded ratio expectation, 107% instead of 114. You can see that in moving even down to the 60% return-seeking portfolio, that expected funding ratio never quite hits 100, 99% 20 years out with the 60% return-seeking portfolio. Now, on the right side of the page, you can see what happens if you increase risk. For example, you move to the 90% return-seeking portfolio. Well, you can accelerate the time frame to a fully funded state and hit a higher ultimate funding ratio. And even further still, if you were to adopt a 100% return-seeking portfolio, even further acceleration, albeit with wider dispersion of outcomes. There's a lot to like, in our view, with the current policy because it hits 2032, it hits full funding by 2032 in the expected case. And so it hits the mark. Now, the question would be, let's say that everything is exactly as we expect and you hit full funding in 2032. There might be some question at that point as to what what the right strategy is on a go-forward basis. Would it make sense to stay in the 78% return-seeking portfolio at that point and shoot for 114 10 years after that? I think that'll be an open question as we reevaluate these studies every 3 years as to whether it makes sense to, at that point, if we were to exactly hit our expectations, it might make sense to pare back at that point and maybe adopt a lower risk strategy to pare back some of that risk exposure and trajectory of funded ratio. But for the time being, there's a lot to like. This picture summarizes it nicely in terms of how the current policy gets from here to there over time. Next slide shows contributions, and very similar to the Chiron projections. I'm not going to expound upon this too much, other than to say central expectation, which is the black dotted line for the city plan, about $500 million, and we would expect that to edge higher over the next 10 or so years as the plan is working back towards a fully funded state. And then as Chiron showed, you could see the numbers fall off thereafter, and they're falling off because of those shortfall amortizations. Once you're fully funded, you have no more shortfalls to amortize, and that would fall off over time. And of course, that's the central expectation. Results could be better or worse, as you can see from our projections. And of course, flexing the investment strategy to the left and to the right gives you different results about what you'd expect. If you're flexing to the left, taking risk off the table, the implication is your contributions will remain expected to be higher for longer. And if you were to increase risk, for example, the converse would be true. Your contributions would be expected to fall off sooner rather than later, albeit with higher risk, higher tail risk. Next slide covers net outflows. And here, this is an important distinction, this study versus last study. Again, the last study, which showed growing net outflows as the population was maturing because the plan was closed. Well, now that the plan is reopened, we see more of a steady state in terms of net outflows. We're not seeing a substantial net outflow. We're not seeing an aging population. And so that has implications as you think about not just your forward-looking financials, but also your investment strategy. So you can see that we're expecting something on the order of 2 to 3% expected net outflows over the course of the next 20 years in the expected case. And in the most extreme case, net outflows about 4%. So there's not a substantial net outflow, even in the most significant of net outflow scenarios in our analysis. Now that's the city plan. The next several pages summarize the Unified Port District and the Airport Authority. Lots of reruns here, particularly the Unified Port District, which has very similar outcomes to the city plan, starts funding ratios in about the same place, ends funding ratios in about the same place, and the same considerations about moving to a less risky or more risky portfolio. So I will simply flip through those slides. The Airport Authority, which is a little different on page 19, which shows funding ratios not in the 80s, but rather just north of 100%, again, on a market value of assets basis. Here you can see that the expected trajectory of funded ratio over the course of time starts just north of 100% and pretty much stays there in the expected case. It largely moves sideways as we had articulated earlier. So a lot to like there as well. Now, the last thing I'll cover is our liquidity analysis. Liquidity analysis, which covers an analysis of the asset allocation and in an effort to try and ensure that there's substantial liquidity, sufficient liquidity to fund plan operations over time. And page 23 covers just the starting point for our liquidity analysis. Here we've categorized your asset allocation in various buckets of liquid or illiquid assets. And you can see here liquid assets in terms of risk reducing, 21.6%. Liquid assets in terms of return seeking, that's primarily public equities, 44.4%. And then various degrees of illiquidity, quasi-liquid, illiquid 5 to 10, and illiquid 10 plus. So quasi-liquid, those are things like core real estate assets. The most illiquid assets, things like private equity. And so you can see those allocations. Now, 34% of the portfolios in illiquid or quasi-liquid assets, as we would categorize them. Now, the question is, with the remainder in liquid assets, 66% in liquid assets, generally speaking, you're going to use liquid assets for plan operations, things like funding your benefit payments and the like. The question is, does the 34% get out of hand in some stressed market environments such that it might swamp the overall portfolio? Or is there sufficient liquidity to pay benefit payments on a go-forward basis, even in the most stressed market environments? And that's what we study on page 24, which is to show a base case, and then a recessionary case, and then a dark skies case, which is a very pessimistic case. Left side of the page, we show the growth of assets in dollars. And the right side of the page shows the asset allocation in percentage terms. And so here you can see on the left side of the page, base case, this is everything works as expected. Your assets would grow, we would expect. And you can see the various shadings of assets, the green shadings being the more liquid assets, the gray and the blue being the less liquid assets. And you can see all assets grow as you would expect on the left side of the page. The asset allocation on the right side of the page starts out 34% illiquid and pretty much stays there over the course of the 10-year period. Now, what happens in a recessionary and a dark skies scenario is that we see in these cases, the dark skies scenario, by the way, is a 99th percentile bad outcome over a 10-year period. You would see 3 years, in that example, 3 years of pronounced downturn in the markets, followed by little to no recovery thereafter. And so you can see that the asset values drop quite a bit, years 1 through 3, and then slow increase, largely attributable to funding that comes into the program. You can see what happens in that case, in the most extreme market stress scenario. While the assets are down, the percentages start to tilt a little bit more towards illiquids, and you can see what happens. That happens primarily in years 1 through 3, before stabilizing at about 47% illiquid. Now, the good news is this is a pretty dire situation, and even then, in the most dire situation that we're summarizing here, there's lots of green. And the lots of green it tells me that there is significant liquidity to fund plan operations on a go-forward basis, fund benefit payments and the like. This isn't always the case. We have clients where the funding is effectively, the plan assets are effectively swamped by illiquids, where the percentage of illiquids becomes 100% because the downturn creates a situation that the portfolio tilts, and that's not tenable. Ultimately, you need some liquidity to pay down benefit payments. Good news here for your plans that there is sufficient liquidity to fund those operations, even in the most dire of situations. And with that, I will take us back to page 25 and summarize again what we started with at the top, which is to say 3 facets of analysis: portfolio analysis, asset liability projection analysis, and liquidity analysis. With the portfolio analysis, your current allocation is 78% return seeking. We like the construct of the fund. We believe it's well diversified across the risk reward spectrum. Expected return on your portfolio about 6.37%, according to our latest and greatest capital market assumptions, and very similar to the actuarial interest rate assumption, 6.5%. As it relates to the asset liability projection analysis, we've reflected the impact of Proposition B and the like. And the good news is we think that your pension plan financials are all pointing in a good direction. So there's a lot to like there as it currently sits. And then finally, as it relates to liquidity, we examine the go-forward liquidity of the fund, and we find sufficient liquidity even in the most stressed of market cases. With that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Phil. This is Katie Kamsack with Aon, and not hearing any questions, I did just want to remind the board of one other item. If we could flip ahead to the next page. Some of you may recall that we kicked off a risk reduction analysis back at the start of 2021. And the goal of this was to evaluate the merits of potentially reducing the risk of the portfolio. Because as we just discussed at the time, the portfolio was maturing, was expected to reach a fully funded status. And the net outflow position was, cash flow was increasing. Now we kicked that off, and you can see here the table shows the project plan that was outlined, and we got through about half of it. And then, as we all know, the repeal of Proposition B came through. And so we decided to pause this analysis and to get through this asset-liability study so that we could take into account the current circumstances and understand what the outlook looked like for the portfolio. And so now, having gone through that, we will be wrapping up this analysis, and we'll be presenting that at the next meeting. And as you just heard from Phil, some of the things have stayed the same. We are expecting the plan to reach full funding over the course of the next 10, 15 years. And so we do think that it still makes sense to evaluate the merits of reducing the risk. What has changed is that net outflow position. And so what that does, we think, allows SDCERS the flexibility to maintain some of the private market exposure because there's less pressure on the illiquidity of the portfolio. And so we will be examining that further over the next few months, and we'll be sharing the completion of this at the next meeting. And so just wanted to preview that and remind you all, as it has been a while since we've touched on this. And so I'll pause again for questions, but I do believe that this is an action item. So if there aren't any, I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you very much, Phil, for your summary of a very important report. As I mentioned earlier, this was an action item and that was approved unanimously by our committee. Paul, do we need to take a vote on this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, then I would call for the vote. Rosie, could you please lead us off?
Yes.
You need a motion and a second.
Oh, now?
Just a motion.
Just a motion. I'm sorry. Then I will move that the staff recommendation for the asset liability study for 2022 be approved by the board.
Paul Kaufman.
I second. Louis Nguyen.
Just if I may note that Mrs. Boone has left the meeting. I will proceed with the vote now. Paul Kaufman.
Yes.
Thomas Battaglia.
Yes.
Michelle Bush.
Yes.
Natasha Colora.
Yes.
Lisa Marie Harris.
Yes.
Charles HOGQUIST.
Aye.
Paul Lodes.
Yes.
Louis Maji.
Yes.
Louis Nguyen.
Yes.
Clifford CHIRESON.
Yes.
And with that, the motion passes 10-0.
Thank you, Rosie. The next action item out of the investment committee was an initial review of the plan's real estate policy and investment plan prepared by our new real estate consultant, Makita. And to lead us through some of this, I'd like to Jamie to give us some summary comments, please.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. The item in front of you is Makita's initial review of SDCERS real estate policy and investment plan. I'd like to provide you a summary of Makita's recommendations. In the real estate policy, the majority of Makita's recommendations are simplifying the terminology within the policy, strengthening the guidelines to limit risk within the portfolio, and removing the medium-term 2% target allocation to core debt. In addition, Makita has included a recommendation to consider the delegation of authority to staff for co-investments. Co-investments offer investors, such as SDCERS, an opportunity to invest in real estate alongside one of SDCERS' existing fund managers at reduced fees. Each co-investment opportunity would be thoroughly evaluated by Makita and staff, and each investment made would be reported back to the investment committee and board after that investment is made. The second component of Makita's analysis looked at the investment plan. Makita has prepared an updated pacing analysis, which is used as a guide to deploy capital each fiscal year. In non-core, SDCERS will target to commit $75 million in non-core strategies in the remainder of this fiscal year. In the core portfolio, there are no commitments being planned for the remainder of this fiscal year. Rather, the focus is on the continued liquidation of the DWS real estate separate account that has one asset remaining. Those funds will be redeployed next fiscal year. Makita also has noted potential areas of interest for new investments. In the non-core space, SDCERS will explore investments in multifamily, industrial, neighborhood retail, and niche strategies such as data centers, medical office, and single-family rentals. Finally, Makita and SDCERS will evaluate the core open-ended fund portfolio to consider consolidating the number of managers, which could result in potential fee savings for SDCERS. The investment committee voted to approve the real estate policy and investment plan 4-0 yesterday. At this point, I'll stop and see if there are any questions that I can answer.
I'm not hearing any questions. Jamie, thank you very much. And also thanks to the team at Makita. It was quite a robust discussion. So I'm going to move that we approve this initial review of our real estate policy and investment plan. And Rosie, could you take the vote, please?
Yes, if you'll just allow me a moment to type in the motion for that.
Okay.
Thank you so much for allowing me that moment. I'm ready to proceed.
Excuse me, Rosie?
Yes.
Could you reflect that Mr. Schierson moved the motion in the computer?
Yes, happy to.
Thank you.
And Rosie, in the motion, we need to say real estate policy and investment plan.
Thank you so much for pointing that out to me. Real estate policy
and investment plan.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Okay, I am ready to proceed if everyone is all right with that. Paul Kaufman?
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Thomas Battaglia?
Yes.
Michelle Bush?
Yes.
Natasha Kalora?
Yes.
Lisa Marie Harris?
Yes.
Charles HOGQUIST?
Aye.
Paul Lotz?
Yes.
Louis Machi?
Yes.
Louis Nguyen?
Yes.
Clifford CHIRESON?
Yes.
And with that, the motion passes 10-0.
Thank you very much. We have three other, I think, important information items to present to the whole board and for your additional background and understanding. The first one is a discussion, an overview of the environmental, social, and governance aspects of real estate. This is a continuation of the so-called ESG presentation from the January Investment Committee meeting that focused then on our public markets, private equity, and infrastructure investments. At yesterday's Investment Committee meeting, the SDCERS real estate consultant, Makita, discussed their ESG capabilities and how SDCERS real estate managers are monitored from an ESG perspective. Staff will be working with its consultants and advisors to determine how best to report ESG data to the board. Demetrius, do you want to comment on any of this at this juncture?
Not too many additional comments. Makita just ran us through the internal initiatives that they're doing from an ESG perspective, including their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, their engagement with managers, and their participation in industry organizations. Currently, in terms of monitoring SDCERS' real estate portfolio, what they do is they have a baseline survey that they send out to every single one of SDCERS' real estate manager, and that kind of gives them data on the ESG efforts that are being undertaken at each firm. So that is in development, and it's what it's going to lead to, hopefully down the road, is Makita will be able to work with each of those managers to build out their ESG programs, the ones that are lacking.
Thank you. The next information item is a topic that's very relevant for the overall plan, but also in its own way for each of us individually, and that is a discussion on inflation and any potential impact on the SDCERS portfolio. At the January meeting, members of the Investment Committee requested staff and the consultants to provide information on the current inflationary environment and how SDCERS portfolio is positioned to respond to higher inflation. Staff provided a report yesterday which outlined several of the causes of the recent uptick in inflation, namely spikes in the price of energy, vehicles, and food due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Aon presented an inflation outlook and discussed how SDCERS portfolio might fare in different inflationary environments. They concluded that SDCERS portfolio is well positioned to withstand inflationary scenarios due to its strong diversification. And Demetrius, I don't know if you or representatives of Aon want to expand on any of this summary for us at this juncture.
The only thing I would add is that the inflationary hedges that SDCERS have in place come from its equities, real estate, and infrastructure investments. Those are really the asset classes that we can look to bolster the portfolio in times of rising inflation.
Very good. And then I'm sorry, is there a question? Okay. Then the third item is the performance report for the calendar quarter ended December 31, 2021. And I'll turn this over in a moment to Anders, but in the fourth quarter, the total fund had a net return of 4.1%, which outperformed the benchmark return of 4%. Performance was driven by strong returns in U.S. equity, in real estate, and in private equity. And for the fiscal year so far, the total fund has returned 5.9% net, which outperformed the benchmark return of 5.2% by some 70 basis points. Anders?
Thanks, Cliff. Good morning, everyone. If we can move to slide 9, please. So this performance report is for the quarter ending December 31st. And at the end of that quarter, the market value of the total fund eclipsed 11 billion for the first time. Fortunately, that was short-lived, and we're at about 10.5 billion as of this week. Nonetheless, the $11 billion valuation represents an increase of about $310 million from the previous quarter. And as Cliff mentioned, that translates into a return of 4.1% beating the benchmark by 0.1% for the quarter. Over the longer term, returns look solid and outpacing the 6.5% actuarial rate of return by a wide margin. You can move to slide 11, please. This slide looks at SDCERS's performance relative to peers. And as you know, our goal is really to earn a return sufficient to ensure SDCERS's ability to pay benefits promised to planned participants. So while peer data is good information, it does not influence the decisions we make regarding plan investments. That said, when looking at these peer returns, we can see a pattern across different market environments that I thought was worthwhile pointing out. When the stock market does very well, like it did in the last quarter of 2021, SDCERS tend to lag peers. And when the stock market has more muted returns, we tend to outperform peers. Why is that? It's because SDCERS has less stock exposure than our typical plan and more allocated to assets that have less correlation to stock markets, like the opportunity fund, for example. So what this does, it decreases the overall risk level in the portfolio. And I thought this was good to see because it highlights how well diversified the portfolio is as we avoid the big down markets, and we might not participate in the very strong up markets as a consequence. If we can move to slide 18. Okay. This slide shows how each asset class contributed and detracted from this quarter's return on a relative basis. So as we can see here, private equity was the main contributor, while U.S. equity contributed modestly. Private equity contributed due to strong COVID-related recovery in Grosvenor's portfolio, and the Stepstone portfolio benefited from its exposure to growth equity. As you may know, growth equity is a sub-asset class of private equity and contains companies that have graduated from their early life cycle and are growing rapidly. The U.S. equity asset class contributed through SDCERS's active management in that asset class from our SMID mandate managed by William Blair. And we also had a positive allocation effect, which contributed to performance for the quarter. And as you may know, the allocation effect really measures the effects of being over and underweight the different asset classes as compared to our targets. So with SDCERS being overweight our private equity allocation and the private equity asset class performed better than the total fund benchmark, we got a positive allocation effect as a result. Over a longer time period, we expect the allocation effect to be negligible as we try to keep each asset class as close to its targets as possible. And looking at the detractors, the Opportunity Fund was the main detractor, as you can see, mainly due to the fact that we compare the Opportunity Fund to 78% stocks and 22% bonds at the fund level, which is also kind of the mix of assets that we talked about in the Asset-Liability study. Because of the Opportunity Fund has a more defensive risk profile than stocks, it also means that it's not going to keep up when the stock market has a strong quarter like it did in the last quarter of 2021. So that concludes my remarks on the performance for the quarter ending December 31st. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to address them.
Thank you very much, Anders. Paul, I think this concludes the comments regarding the investment committee meeting from yesterday.
Thank you, Cliff. That was a nice presentation. Greg, do you want to take a break here at some point? We could either do that now or just before we go into closed session.
Paul, I agree. A break is a good idea. Can we get through through the questions and comments, and then as we transition into closed session, that would be an outstanding time for a break.
Okay, perfect. So let's move on to Section 9, which is the questions and comments from President, trustees, and staff. I do have an announcement. At this time, I would like to ask for volunteers to serve on an ad hoc presidential nominating committee to make recommendations to the board at our next board president, whose term will begin in May of this coming year. We can have up to 6 members on the ad hoc committee. Do I have any volunteers at this point?
I will volunteer Lisa Marie Harris.
Thank you, Lisa. Anybody else?
I will also volunteer Michelle Bush.
Michelle, thank you.
Lou Maggi as well.
Lou, thank you.
Paul, I believe Cliff is raising his hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, Cliff. Great. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Greg, I think we got 4 people on board. That seems like sufficient. Is that all right from your perspective?
That sounds like an amazing committee. It would be also nice to see if we could designate a committee chair.
Okay. Do we have a volunteer for a committee chair between Lisa, Michelle, Lou, and Cliff?
I'll volunteer. Lisa Marie.
Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate it. Okay. So I'd like to thank you all for volunteering, and from this group, we would like to, we've already got the chair selected. Thank you. So do we have any other comments or questions from the board members regarding the overall proceedings today? I don't hear anything. Do we have, I'm sorry.
I was just curious, is the goal for us to meet in person at the July meeting, or we're still to be determined?
I believe the goal for the committee would be to nominate a board president to be presented at the May meeting to be voted on.
Oh, no, I understand that. I'm asking about our virtual versus in-person meeting. When is the goal for us to meet in person?
Oh, Greg, I'll turn that over to you.
I would love to address that during my CEO comments.
Okay, thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Lisa. Do we have any questions or comments from staff?
Why, yes, I have some questions and comments. Actually, more comments. I always like to talk. To begin with, I'd really like to take a moment to thank Karina Coleman for her board service. And although she can't be with us today, I really wanted to express my gratitude for her service since she was joined the investment committee 7 years ago in March 2015 as an independent non-board member. She was so spectacular that she was appointed by the city council to the board in January of 2016. And during her tenure, our assets grew from approximately $7 billion to nearly $11 billion, with the city retirement plan funding increasing from 70% to 74%, while lowering our discount rate from 7.25% all the way down to 6.5%. Now, Karina was typical in that she volunteered her time to SDCERS while maintaining a very busy professional career and raising a family. Yet she found time to step into leadership roles of the investment committee chair, vice president, and president. So thank you, Karina. We really appreciate you, and we miss you already. I would also like to thank LANA RADCHENKO for being our audit committee chair and for providing the board her very first audit committee report. Well done. And I'd like to thank Paul Kaufman for seamlessly transitioning from being our board vice president to our board president. I thought your first meeting went exceptionally well. Thank you. And speaking of meetings, we are hopeful we can transition to in-person committee and board meetings in May of 2022. Now, I think there's 3 issues that need to come into alignment for this to happen. First and foremost is the overall health of our community and the go-ahead from health officials to meet in person, which that looks like that's coming along nicely. Second is the board's willingness to meet in person. Again, overall health is paramount for everyone involved. And third is the status of our meeting room. The building's new owners are renovating the 3rd floor area, and we are expecting the room to be available in May. But those of us who have suffered through a remodel project know construction schedulers are optimists. So we will see, but we are hopeful. I'd also like to highlight Marcel's Proposition B update in the Business and Governance Committee's Benefits Administration Division report on the status of the city's reopening of the pension plan for employees hired between 2012 and 2021. Subsequent to her report, the city completed its employee data file, and this was sent to Chiron to begin crunching the numbers. Now, while the data file creation required more time than the project budgeted, we remain hopeful that the project will be executed timely. We'll be keeping the board informed as the project moves forward. Now, importantly, as the project ends and we know the cost factors for the employees electing to join the plan, the board will need to address outstanding amounts owed. For example, the employer's normal cost contribution until the valuations processes 2-year time lag can catch up. So we anticipate doing this at our November 2022 board meeting. We are already on Chiron's calendar for that. I would also like to highlight a report from the investment committee, which was made under questions and comments addressing the Russia-Ukraine conflict and SDCERS exposure to Russian investments. Although Russia boasts the 11th largest economy, SDCERS exposure prior to the conflict was limited to approximately 42 million in Russian investments. This represents less than 0.5% of the total investment portfolio. SDCERS investment managers reduced these holdings to approximately 18 million as the conflict began. SDCERS currently holds approximately 2 million in Ukrainian securities, and the remaining Russian holdings are valued at approximately 3 million, together being less than 0.1% of our portfolio. In other words, over 99.9% of the portfolio is not held in Ukrainian or Russian investments. I would also like to recognize our staff who supported the board during the 2022 meeting in this virtual format: Melody Hazard, Monty Prieto, Joe Saucedo, and Michelle Wegner-Malecki, along with contractor Tab Perryman. I would also like to recognize Johnny Tran for serving as the CalPERS Attorney Roundtable Chair. It's always excellent when we have members of SDCERS out there engaged in our retirement pension community. And last but not least, I would like to thank LANA RADCHENKO, SDCERS Audit Committee Chair, for the invitation to talk about retirement security at the San Diego Finance Executives International meeting, which included a conversation about the city's pension crisis, the city pension reforms, Proposition B, and SDCERS' current exemplary governance structure and funding plan. And thank you very much. This concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Greg. We're going to move into closed session to go into conference with legal counsel regarding the existing litigation. So if you're not part of the closed session, please close your Zoom meeting. Rosie's going to need about 3 to 5 minutes to make sure Zoom participants are correct and to stop the live streaming. But before we come back, I think we're going to take a small break here for about 10 minutes. So Rosie, if you can do your thing, and I'd like to request that all board members be back on line here at about 10:28. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rosie, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Hey, Rosie, how are you?
Doing well, Paul. Thank you. How are
Good.
you?
Can you pop us back into open session when you're ready?
Yes, absolutely. 1 second.
Well, thank you for a very well-run meeting.
Thank you, Johnny.
Okay, we are ready to proceed.
Long live the king.
Okay.
Or at least till the May meeting. I don't know.
All right, we are back in open session. So Johnny, can you please provide the closed session report?
Yes, thank you, Paul. In December 2020, SDCERS filed a lawsuit against Allianz Global Investments to recover losses from the Structured Alpha U.S. Equity Fund. Now, on January 14, 2022, by a vote of 10-0, this board authorized its attorneys to settle the action. Those voting for the settlement were board members Bartolotta, Battaglia, Bush, Coleman, Kalura, Harris, Kaufman, Maggi, Shearson, and Spoon. Today, we are very pleased to announce that SDCERS has reached an agreement to settle its claims, and the litigation has now concluded. Our pursuit of this litigation reflects a staunch commitment to protecting our members' interests, and we are pleased to have obtained a recovery and resolved this action. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Johnny. So we have come to the end of our agenda. This meeting is adjourned. Our next meeting will be May 13th, 2022. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody, and we'll see I'll leave the meeting and we can move on from there.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Nice job, Paul.
Rosie, Michelle.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Have a great weekend.